Welcome. Let me welcome you all to our lecture tonight. And the very first thing I want to do is just remind you to silence your devices. So if you could put those in airplane mode or silence them, that would be great. And also make sure you have your attention focused on our event. I'm Glenn Moots. I'm a professor here at Northwood University and also director of Northwood University's Forum for Citizenship and Enterprise. And we have semester programs. This is actually our second event of the semester. And I'd like to, while I'm up here, plug our next two. On Saturday, April 8th, we're sponsoring two panels on the subject of work and virtue. And those will be at 9:30 and 2 o'clock in the Sloan Building in the auditorium room 114. And that's actually part of a statewide student colloquium. We have students coming here actually from all over the state for discussions and also for those panels. But if you'd like to come and join us for the panels, you're more than welcome to. We'll actually have faculty from around the state who will be, again, addressing the topic of work and virtue. On Thursday, April 20th, right here, we will have a debate on the ACA, or as it's also known, Obamacare. And I'm actually kind of happy that the revision or repeal or replace or whatever it was didn't go through, because that way we can have the debate. And so we have Paul Howard coming here from the Manhattan Institute, and he is a critic of the ACA. And we have John Freeman, who's actually local here in Michigan. He's advocated for the ACA in multiple levels, and he will be arguing in favor of the ACA. So we hope to see you there for that. And as you know, we've had some very successful debates in the past. Debates are great. They bring out the best in the people who are in them, and usually, and also enables you to hear both sides of an issue, which is great. So that is on Thursday, April 20th. And if you want me to put you on a list and keep you informed of what's going on, just let me know and give me an email contact, and I'll be happy to put you on a list so that you can be updated. We'll have lots of good programs in the fall as well. Now, I want to extend our gratitude to our sponsor, the National Review Institute. They have a panel in the back. You may have seen it. It was founded in 1991 by William F. Buckley, Jr. to advance the conservative principles he championed and to complement the mission of National Review magazine, and also to support National Review's best talent. And to that end, the National Review Institute partners with universities like ours and other institutions to host writers and speakers, and we're very thankful to them for bringing Jay to speak to us tonight. Now, if you're not familiar with the National Review in print or online, you can actually get a free online subscription. And Nate, who's in the back there, will be manning the table, and you just go and sign up. And how long is a subscription, Nate?
Full year.
Full year. Okay, so you get a full year online subscription free of charge as a student. Our co-sponsors also include the Mackinac Center for Public Policy, and we're pleased to have their guests with us here tonight. The Mackinac Center is here in Midland, not far at all, and they are the largest state-based free market think tank in America. They focus on policy here in Michigan, and you can find them online. They provide outstanding information to help you understand public policy and law. Also, our semester programming is sponsored by the Institute for Humane Studies and the Templeton Foundation, and they have been our partners in past semesters as well, and they are also helping us with tonight's event. IHS advances a freer society by facilitating the development of students and scholars who share an interest in liberty. And students, if you have an interest in those programs, again, let me know, and I'll be happy to tell you more about those, including some very fine summer opportunities to learn more about liberty. Now, IHS wants your feedback. So when you came in, there were 3 students who hopefully gently but firmly handed you a survey. And we'd like you to fill those out and make sure you return those. We'll have some baskets and boxes. Students will be collecting those as well. And that will let us know what you think about tonight's program, and also give you an opportunity to be in touch with the Institute for Humane Studies. Well, with that, let me turn to introducing our speaker, Mr. Jay Nordlinger. Mr. Nordlinger is Senior Editor of National Review and a book fellow of the National Review Institute. He writes on a variety of subjects, including politics, foreign affairs, and the arts. He is music critic for the New Criterion, Since 2002, he has hosted a series of public interviews at the Salzburg Festival. For the National Review website, he writes a column called Impromptus, and with Mona Charen, he hosts the Need to Know podcasts. He also hosts a podcast called Q&A. In 2011, he filmed The Human Parade with Jay Nordlinger, a TV series bringing hour-long interviews with various personalities. His latest book is Digging In, Further Collected Writings of Jay Nordlinger. He is also author of Children of Monsters, an inquiry into the sons and daughters of dictators, and Peace, They Say, a history of the Nobel Peace Prize. Some 100 pieces are gathered in Here, There, and Everywhere, collected writings of Jay Nordlinger. He is a native Michigander, though he lives in New York. We won't hold that against him. Two of Jay's books are for sale tonight. Nate is also handling that. I believe Jay's latest, as well as Children of Dictators, which is the subject of tonight's lecture. Given our emphasis on freedom here at Northwood, we've asked Jay to speak on Children of Monsters, his book about the sons and daughters of dictators. He'll speak for about 40 minutes, and then we'll have some time for questions and answers. And I also hope that you will join us for cake and a reception in the upstairs lobby. With that, please join me in welcoming Mr. Jay Nordlinger.
Well, thank you so much. It's nice to be here. What a kind, clear, and crisp introduction that was. I've heard a great many. We'll be home in time for the basketball game, I assure you. It's in the West. It's at 9:20. We have loads of time. I'm grateful to the hosts. I think we have about 3 hosts, and I admire them all. Mackinac Center, Northwood, my own National Review Institute. I'm from Ann Arbor, and I knew Northwood when I was growing up as the Northwood Institute. And it became a university when I wasn't looking, I think. And also, I was mentioning to some people earlier, I think most didn't know what I was talking about, but there was a musical institution here called the Northwood Sinfonietta. I remember it well from my upbringing, but maybe it's maybe a symphony orchestra or something like that at this point. Anyway, glad to be here. This is a strange book, I must say, but an interesting book. Children of Monsters. It's ghoulish in parts. It tells you something about history, maybe a little about human beings. I was mentioning to someone at a reception before, I really enjoyed writing this book, researching and writing it, and I was also glad to be done with it. It's one of those books, and I'll tell you how it began, how the idea came to me, because it is so odd. I was in Albania many years ago. I say many years ago. I think it was 2002. That qualifies as many. And Albania was about 10 years past the collapse of communism, although the country was in very bad shape as it is now. And Albania had one of the worst dictatorships in Europe, one of the worst dictatorships in the world, that of Enver Hoxha. It was a perfect totalitarian state. There was nothing else like it in the world except for the Kim dictatorship in North Korea, which is still going on. They're on their 3rd Kim right now. But Albania was kind of a European North Korea. No one went out, no one came in. And it was ruled as a kind of personal prison by Enver Hoxha. And it occurred to me to ask someone when I was there, did Hoxha have children? Because I couldn't imagine being the son or daughter of such a person. And I wondered, if you are the son or daughter of Hoxha, could you go out? Could you face people? Did they despise you? Did they admire you? Did you have to change your name, leave the country, or what? And yes, Hoxha had 3 children, 2 sons and a daughter. And the daughter was an architect who had helped design the shrine to her father in the center of the capital. And I thought, because I'm a magazine writer, and you're always looking for, a friend of mine says, you never know where your next meal is coming from. I thought that I could do a magazine piece on the Hoxha children. And then it occurred to me that you could do a survey of such sons and daughters and make a book of it called Children of Monsters. And I put that idea on the back burner for a long time, and at some point brought it out. So my book discusses 20 dictators, an even 20, and you might think that I aimed for that number because it's such a nice, juicy, round number. But the truth is I drew up a list of dictators I would survey, and it happened to come to 20. A couple of dictators I would have included, but they didn't have children, and I think of Lenin in particular. Also Ho Chi Minh in Vietnam. And all of these dictators come from the 20th century. One of them, Fidel Castro, ruled into the 21st. The son of one of them rules Syria right now. And as I mentioned, North Korea is on its third Kim. You could have gone back to antiquity. Caligula had a child, just one, a little girl, who was murdered in most gruesome fashion the same day her parents were murdered in the year 41. Or you could have gone to 16th century Russia and Ivan the Terrible, who killed his son, the Tsarevich, also named Ivan, with his own scepter. He bashed his head in. He didn't really mean to, if I may say. It was a fit of rage. And he killed his son and was immediately horrified. And this moment was immortalized by a famous painting in the 19th century by the Russian painter Repin. It's a haunting painting. So I don't do Ivan the Terrible. I don't do anything before the 20th century. I do he called himself the Emperor Bokassa. He crowned himself emperor Napoleon style in the country he renamed the Central African Empire. He killed people with his scepter. It wasn't so much a scepter as a walking stick made of ebony, a very hard wood. He killed people with it. He did not kill any of his own children, so far as I know, but he did imprison a couple of his sons when he thought they needed to be punished. So I've got 20 of these characters, a murderer's row, and really I went for the worst of the worst. You have to be pretty bad to qualify for my book. Body count mattered, to be blunt about it. And there are a couple of dictators who don't quite belong in my book. I put them in for various reasons. There are about two who don't belong in a book with the word monsters in the title, but close enough. So I'll give you my lineup. I begin with World War II era dictators: Hitler, Mussolini, Franco, Stalin, and Tojo. And then I stay in the Far East for Mao in China and Kim in North Korea. Then back to Europe for Hoxha in Albania and Ceausescu in Romania. Then to the Caribbean for Duvalier in Haiti and Fidel Castro in Cuba. I do mention Raul and his family. And I have three Arab dictators: Gaddafi in Libya, Assad in Syria, and Saddam in Iraq. Then to Iran for Khomeini. Four Africans: Mobutu of the country that he renamed Zaire. They're known as the DRC, the Democratic Republic of Congo. Bokassa, the Emperor Bokassa. Idi Amin in Uganda. And Mengistu, who is known as the Stalin of Ethiopia. And he earned that designation. And my final chapter, which is really more like a coda, is about Pol Pot, the dictator of Cambodia, the leader of the Khmer Rouge, and his late-in-life daughter, who's a lovely young woman who got married a couple of years ago. Such a strange story. Her father's one of the worst genocidalists in all of history. So you can do a lot with these, my kids, I call them. There's a lot to say about them. You can think of them as a group, and my book is in part a psychological study, but only in part because although these men and women share a common circumstance, they're all the son or daughter of a dictator, they are individuals, and they cope with that circumstance in their own individual ways. So I tried not to generalize too much. Every time I went to generalize, I could contradict it. And in fact, some critics criticized me for not making enough of these men and women as a group. But I found that when I went to make sweeping statements, they weren't quite right. So I thought I would touch on a few of these families, give you a kind of sampler. Beginning with Hitler, and you might think that'll be a short section because everyone knows that Hitler had no children, which is true, but there was a claimant. In this case I write about. There was a Frenchman named Jean-Marie Laurey who said he was the son of Hitler and believed himself to be. He was told this by his mother, who was a peasant girl in France during World War I, and she said she had this liaison with this Austro-German soldier, and a son was born in 1918, Jean-Marie, and he grew up not knowing who his father was. He was taunted as a fils de bouche, which is a very rude phrase for a son of an unknown German soldier. And he fought in the French army during World War II. And then one fine day, in 1948, when he was 30, his mother said, "Oh, that father you've always wondered about, that was Hitler, the late Chancellor of Germany, and the most despised man in the world." And that's a fine how do you do. And he immediately denied it within himself, and he was tormented by it for about 20 years. And then he did, according to him, rigorous research on the subject. He came to believe it was true. And now, most historians believe that this is not so, that this man was not the son of Hitler. I must say, for not being the son of Hitler, he looked an awful lot like him, as does his son Philippe, who lives in France, with not one but two portraits of Hitler on the living room wall. But what's important from my book is that this man, Jean-Marie, believed himself to be the son of Hitler. And what effect did that have on him? And the answer, I'm afraid, is very, very bad. And so I begin my book with this case and then move on to the charming Mussolinis in Italy. And Benito Mussolini had 5 children officially. Almost all these guys have unofficial children, or as I call them, extracurricular children. Mussolini's eldest official child was a girl named Edda, who grew up to marry a fellow named Count Ciano, who became Mussolini's foreign minister. And he was executed. Did Mussolini kill him? That's a little bit murky. He certainly refused to stay the execution. Of course, the Nazis had great influence. But imagine that you're Edda Mussolini. There are 2 men you love more than any other people in the world, your husband and your father, and the one effectively kills the other. That is a circumstance not dealt to very many people at all. Mussolini's youngest son was a kid named Romano, who liked music and became a jazz pianist. And at first he performed under a pseudonym. He called himself Romano Full. But then he discovered that his name was more of a draw than a repellent. So he formed a group called the Romano Mussolini All-Stars. And they performed with Ella Fitzgerald and Dizzy Gillespie and Duke Ellington and all the greats of the period. And this man, Romano, married the sister of Sophia Loren, the most famous actress in Italy and one of the most famous actresses in all the world. They had 2 daughters, including Alessandra, who is today the leader of neo-fascism in Italy and is a member of the European Parliament and a real piece of work. She has a medical degree. She was on the cover of Playboy. She is flamboyant. She's a chip off the old block. The Mussolinis are a very, very interesting crew. Probably all too interesting if you have to be among them. So I thought I'd give you a word about the Stalins in Russia. The most famous son or daughter of a dictator is Svetlana Stalin, if you don't count the sons who succeeded their father in office, so to speak. So that would be, Baby Doc Duvalier and the Assad kid in Syria and 2 Kims in North Korea. Svetlana Stalin is the most famous. And there are 2 reasons for this. First, she defected to the West, to the United States, in 1967, causing a worldwide sensation. But the more important reason, I think, is that she got it all down in 3 memoirs. She was a wonderful writer, a real thinker, badly screwed up, as you might well imagine, but a writer of some literary power, and she really had stories to tell. You wouldn't wish these stories on anyone, but she did have them to tell. And so she got famous and rich until she got less famous and poor. It was a very interesting life. She was born in the Kremlin, the princess of the whole vast Soviet Empire. And he died alone many years later in a Wisconsin nursing home. And I thought I'd give you one little tidbit. I happen to like this a lot. So she defected in India under circumstances I could get into. She walked into the U.S. Embassy and asked for political asylum. And our guy on duty said, "So, you say you're Stalin's daughter. The Stalin?" I just love that story. It's one of my favorites. There's a lot to say about her, but I'm going to move on in this sampler to Tojo in Japan, who had 7 children, and I must say, he was a rather good father, if you will permit me, and he prepared his children for his execution in a pretty conscientious way, I would say. And his youngest daughter, Kimmy, came to the University of Michigan to study. And she moved into the same residence hall as my mother, who is here tonight, the Martha Cook Residence Hall in Ann Arbor, but a year after my mom left. And Kimmy studied English, married an American named Dennis Gilbertson, became Kimmy T. Gilbertson, T for Tojo, became an American citizen. And this is really funny about history. She lives in Honolulu, a stone's throw from Pearl Harbor, which her father attacked, thus launching the Pacific War, whose aim was to destroy the United States. Who's next? Someone reminded me at the reception before this event that there was a death in the Kim family recently. A half-brother of the current dictator, Kim Jong-un, this is a fellow whose name was Kim Jong-nam, was assassinated in the airport in Kuala Lumpur, Malaysia. And this is a fellow who had been dodging assassination by his half-brother, whom he had never met, for years. This is quite a crew, this family, a lousy family. I'm going to tell you something relatively light, if you can believe it, about the Kim family. So there are 3 dictators: the founding dictator, Kim Il-sung, his son, Kim Jong-il, and the current dictator. On television the other day, Senator McCain referred to him as, and I quote, "that crazy fat kid who runs North Korea." He meant Kim Jong-un. Well, his dad, Kim Jong-il, was a fanatic fan of basketball. He followed the NBA obsessively. His favorite player was Michael Jordan. And when our Secretary of State, Madeleine Albright, went to North Korea in 2000, she brought with her a basketball signed by Jordan. And that basketball now resides in the Foreign Gifts Exhibition Hall in the North Korean capital, along with, just for example, I have it written down, a crocodile briefcase from Fidel Castro, a gem-encrusted sword from Yasser Arafat, and a bear's head from the Romanian dictator, Ceausescu. So the current Kim dictator also loves basketball, and that explains his relationship, his odd relationship with our former Piston, Dennis Rodman. And it's through Dennis Rodman that we know the name of Kim Jong-un's daughter. Apparently not even our intelligence agencies knew it, but Rodman learned it and happened to speak it at a press conference. Isn't that strange? So, Mr. Ceausescu, who was the dictator of Romania, one of the cruelest men who ever came down the pike, and his wife and one of his sons were possibly even worse. And I had a hell of a surprise about 20 minutes ago, half an hour ago, when I met a lady, a professor here, whose husband knew these boys, the Ceausescu boys, Professor Grigoras. You could have blown me down. And there are a couple things I couldn't find out about them that she knew. Maybe there'll be another edition. So there's a lot to say about the Ceausescus. It's a pretty big chapter in my book. But I just want to say one thing about the execution of this couple, Nick and Elena. It was Christmas Day, 1989. And they were just summarily shot. And I must say that Ceausescu went out rather bravely, singing the Internationale, the communist hymn. I believe it was a kind of prayer Some people say that everyone has a religion, whether he does or not. I think it was a kind of prayer. Elena, Mrs. Ceausescu, did not go out so prayerfully. She went out cursing her executioners in the saltiest Romanian. Am I correct? Yeah. Not for the squeamish. Neither are the Gaddafis. So Gaddafi in Libya, he had 7 sons, goons, brutes, horrible men. How could they be otherwise, you might ask? But there was one who tried to go straight, so to speak. And by that, I mean he tried to be a good Western-style liberal, or at least an Arab reformer. His name was Saif al-Islam, and he talked a lot about democracy. He went to the London School of Economics. He swanned around the West. I met him in Davos. I think he was well-meaning. And I'll tell you a story. Some of us were sitting around with the son of Gaddafi in Switzerland, and he said, "Do you know why we Arabs lose all of our wars to Israel?" And your ears perk up, Why? Because Israel's a democracy and we're not. So in our countries, the worst general becomes the army chief of staff because he's no threat to stage a coup d'etat against the strongman. Israel's democratic, so the best rise to the top. I thought that was an interesting observation. So he tried to go straight. But when the crunch came, when his father's regime was under attack in the Libyan civil war, he went home, grew a beard, committed war crimes, and is now under house arrest in Libya and wanted by The Hague for war crimes. The Libyan government has refused to extradite him. And so I think in the end, with that kid, the pull of blood, family dictatorship, maybe a lust for power, proves simply too strong. I want to give you a word about Assad, Bashar Assad, who's killed so many in Syria. Thousands, hundreds of thousands more than the old man Hafez ever dreamed of. And he killed plenty, believe me, including 20,000 in Hama alone. Bashar was never supposed to be dictator, never supposed to be the successor. It was his elder brother, Bassel. He was the one. He was the golden boy. In fact, they call him the golden knight because he rode horses. He was perfect. He was a dictator in waiting out of central casting. He was handsome. He was talented. He was smart. He was charismatic. He was groomed for it. Bashar was totally different. Gawky, shy, awkward, pencil-necked. Bassel, at age 31, was killed in a car accident. He was rushing to the airport. It was a foggy morning. He was taking a Lufthansa flight to Germany. The flight was delayed. He didn't know it. He went in a roundabout, flipped his Mercedes, died. Bashar was practicing eye surgery at the Western Eye Hospital in London. And he was called home to be groomed. Bashar never wanted anything to do with dictatorship, power, politics, anything. But he was put on speed grooming, so to speak, and when his dad died in 2000, Bashar took over. And he has kept the family business going at the cost of, I don't know how many hundreds of thousands killed, certainly more than 1 million exiled. And I'll give you a sense of the relationship between Bashar and his father. The first time he ever entered his father's office, Bashar was 7 years old. He had just had his first French lesson. That used to be the language of the Syrian elite. And he was so excited about it, he burst into his dad's office to tell him. The next time he entered that office was after his father's funeral, when he himself was dictator. Now I want to give you a quick word about Saddam and Uday and Qusay. As Senator McCain says, I keep quoting him, those scamps. Oh, they were horrible boys, Saddam's sons. By the way, Saddam had 3 daughters. 2 of them married brothers who were cousins of Saddam. They defected with their wives and children to Jordan. Saddam induced them to return, and he killed the sons-in-law, thus widowing his daughters. So this is something that Benito Mussolini has in common with those 2 daughters of Saddam. I'll give you this tidbit. There was a time when the FBI was interrogating Saddam, between when our forces pulled him from that so-called spider hole and the time he was executed. And Saddam some days was in a very confessional mood. He wanted to talk. And our guy said to him, "Have you designated a successor? Were you going to make Uday or Qusay your successor?" He said, "No, never." I learned early in 1970, I saw the son of the Sultan of Oman stage a coup against his dad. And that told me, don't let the boys get too close. And Saddam always kept his family at arm's length. He was a horrible, monstrous human being, Saddam Hussein. But let me tell you something all these dictators have in common. Not that you asked, and it's not in my notes, but I'm going to tell you. And it's rather, I'm sort of sorry to say it, they're all smart, very smart. And they're not any dumb dictators who last very long. They're extremely cunning at a minimum. And Saddam Hussein had this ability. I'm going to give you a quickie on Khomeini. 5 children, I think, 2 sons, both of whom died in mysterious circumstances. One of them was almost certainly murdered after his father's death. But there was a grandchild, Hussein Khomeini, who was a genuine liberal Democrat, a believer in liberal democracy, and an opponent of his grandfather's theocratic dictatorship. And after the overthrow of Saddam, this young man went to Iraq. Then he came to Washington, and he was out of Iran for about 9 months, talking about freedom and democracy, and calling on American and other forces to help Iranians do away with this horrible dictatorship established by the old man in 1979. And at the end of 2003, he got an urgent phone call from his grandmother, the imam's widow, saying, "Come home immediately," because there had been threats. You can be assured that these were physical threats against the Khomeini family. And so this boy went home to Iran, and I believe has been under house arrest ever since. And that was in the very first days of 2004. Go to Africa for Idi Amin. He had 60 children, 60 children, with 7 official wives. There are 21 mothers, and the span, we believe that the first child was born in 1948 and the last one was born in 1995. That's pretty hard work. And I interviewed one of his sons, Jafar, who's a quite interesting character, who works for reconciliation in Uganda. He is, if I can use a modern psychological term, he's conflicted. On his better side, well, he knows that his father was monstrous and killed a lot of people, but he also admires his father, makes excuses for him. It depends on which side of his mouth he's talking. But he's done a lot more than most of these sons and daughters, and after a fashion, I admire him. I'll give you a funny little fact about Idi Amin's long exile in Jeddah, Saudi Arabia. He drove a Chevy Caprice Classic station wagon and loved it and took his family to the Safeway to shop. And he was a jolly, fun-loving father most of the time to his brood. He could be terrifying, but he had this fun side. And you sometimes get that with these dictatorial fathers. And I'll end this little sampler with Pol Pot. He had a wife. They studied in France the way all the Khmer Rouge leaders did. They learned their communism there. Pol Pot and his wife married on Bastille Day, which is as close as they had to a holy day. During the reign of the Khmer Rouge, she went crazy, and he divorced her. And when he was about 60, the Khmer Rouge were in the jungles, hiding out, doing some fighting. His cadres decided that he needed a wife, and they found a wife for him, an ammunition porter, a young woman. And he had this late-in-life child, his only child, and he loved her and treated her very tenderly, and she loved him. And he died when she was 12. And she went to Malaysia and she got a master's degree in English. And the reason I say this in a marveling tone is you have to imagine that when the Khmer Rouge killed people who wore glasses on grounds that they had read something and therefore might pose a danger to the regime. And this girl, the daughter of Pol Pot, earned a master's degree in English. I ask you, and she's a lovely woman who speaks well of her father, who killed, along with his comrades, between a fourth and a third of the Cambodian population. So, all these children, as I've said, have lived individual lives We can generalize a little, but I wonder what to do with this question of nature-nurture. And here I go back to the Ceausescu boys. Now, there were two boys, Valentin the older and Nicu the younger. Nicu was a perfect little monster, a monsterlet of a monster, who spent his life swaggering and strutting and raping and killing his way through Romania. He killed many people and raped many, many more. He was a psychotic monster. Valentin didn't want anything to do with power, politics, the dictatorship, became a physicist at a very early age, and I believe has worked at the same scientific institute outside of Bucharest the whole of his career. As far as I know, he's never harmed a hair on anyone's head. Where does that leave me with nature and nurture? As President Obama once said, that's above my pay grade. I don't know. And some of these kids are perfect brutes. Certainly the successor dictators, certainly the two sons of Saddam, one son of Mobutu. This is kind of cute. One son of Mobutu was so bad that his nickname was Saddam, because he was so violent and such a killer. I'll tell you something these guys and women have in common. They are deniers. They reshape history. And you can hardly blame them. When I was working on this book, I passed a poster for a Broadway show, Jersey Boys. And it had a tagline, and it said, "Everyone remembers it the way they need to." And I thought, that's true of my kids, so to speak, these sons and daughters I'm studying. They're remembering it the way they need to. I think it's a kind of coping mechanism, forgive the psycho jargon. I think otherwise they'd be driven crazy. And a lot of these people were crazy enough. And I wondered also while I was writing this book how much slack to cut these people. I had a friend who was the middle son of Alexander Solzhenitsyn, a great writer and hero dissident. Ignat Solzhenitsyn, his name is. He's a pianist and conductor. And one day, we were talking about the Stalin children, Vasily Stalin. He had an older brother who was very sad, and Svetlana. And Ignat said something, and I said, it occurred to me that Vasily Stalin and Ignat Solzhenitsyn are exact counterparts. Vasily was a son of the worst man in the history of the Soviet Union. Ignat is a son of arguably the best man in the history of the Soviet Union, and neither one chose it. Right? Neither one. And now, Vasily was a terrible man, and I'm not excusing him. He hurt a lot of people. He was a Nicu Ceausescu of the Soviet Union. He did nothing but rape and kill, and both of these boys, by the way, drank themselves to death in their early 40s. But consider this. Their mother, Vasily and Svetlana's mother, killed herself when Vasily was 11. I think Svetlana was 8. And Svetlana was lucky in this respect. She was raised by warm, Christianly nannies. Vasily was raised by his father's security agents, the hardest, most vicious men in the whole NKVD, the Soviet secret police. It would have been pretty hard to turn out non-vicious, and he didn't. He was unbelievably vicious. And so how much slack do you cut? That's a question I really can't answer definitively. Also, loyalty is generally a good trait. You want to be loyal to your parents and your country, etc. But what if your father is a murderous dictator? What then? John Kennedy said famously about politics, sometimes party loyalty asks too much. Sometimes family loyalty asks too much too. And it killed a lot of these people to break from their family. If they did, Svetlana defected. One of Castro's daughters defected. Her name is Alina Fernandez. But they were always haunted by it, and sometimes they felt very, very guilty about it. Before I wrap up and we have questions, when you write a book, you have ideas about the book, and you think you know what the book is about and what the important points are. But sometimes readers take away things from the book that you wouldn't have thought they would. And I got several comments from readers of this book who said that the book made them more appreciative than ever of living in a liberal democracy like the United States. Under the rule of law, in an atmosphere of ordered liberty, because dictatorships are, among other things, so capricious, so whimsical, so unpredictable. You don't necessarily know what the rules are, and when the knock will come at the door in the middle of the night. You're always off guard, and the rule of law is a relatively rare and a certainly blessed thing. So without little homily, I'm going to say thank you, and let's have questions. Thank you so much. As far as I'm concerned, I don't know what your teachers have told you, so as far as I'm concerned, you can ask about whatever you like. This book, politics, history, music, sports, I really don't care. It's kind of it's like open mic night. Ask about whatever you like. Sir?
Yes, how many of the children of the dictators did you actually interview?
It's been a while since I've written this book, I must tell you. I think face-to-face and voice-to-voice, about 3. I talked to a great many associates, other family members. First of all, most of the kids I cover are unavailable. They're in prison or dead. And the ones who aren't are very, very reluctant. Very reluctant. It's sort of hard to walk up to someone and say, I'm writing this book called Children of Monsters. Tell me about your dad. And there are very few available. But I was able to learn a lot by hook or crook through all sorts of people within the orbit of these people. The chattiest was Jafar Amin. You could ask him anything. He took no offense. It was amazing. Absolutely amazing. Alina, I was scheduled to talk to. Alina Fernandez, one of the daughters of Castro. He had a great many children, most of them unofficial. Her mother got very sick. She'd never been back to Cuba. And she needed to be in the good graces of the regime. And she didn't want to say anything about her dad. And she did go back to be with her mother when she died. Very sad case. Alina wrote a memoir that is, forgive the cliche, searing. She's quite a woman. She's, not one of these kids is what you'd call normal, really. But some are less nuts than others. And your heart goes out to them.
As someone who could never really understand their circumstances because you never lived through that, how difficult was it not to judge these people when you sat down with them and had a conversation?
There are sometimes reminders of the atrocities that had taken place. And then you gulp a little. But you realize that they're playing the hand that they were dealt, which is not necessarily an advantageous hand. And the funny thing about these kids is they're both enormously privileged with money and so on, and also disadvantaged because they are so shafted later in life when the regime falls. They are exiled, imprisoned, or killed. That's why so many are unavailable. So involuntarily, through no fault or request of their own, they were brought into this world. It's much like being brought into a mafia family. Much the same. Very hard to break away, even if you want to. And so I found out all I could about these men and women, but still you don't quite know what's in their heads and hearts unless they tell you or write a book. And that's relatively rare.
Which dictator did you find most interesting, whether it was researching or interviewing your children?
I'll tell you which dictator I thought was most blood-chilling. And, they're all kind of tied. I can say anyone's worse than Stalin or Saddam Hussein or Enver Hoxha or the Kims. But, there's a movie probably before you were born called Something About Mary. There's something about Mao. And I think I could put my finger on it. I mean, sure, he killed about 70 million people, but the thing about Mao was he was so cold, so intellectual. And forgive me for saying this, but you can almost relate to Saddam Hussein as a human being. He was volatile. He had emotions. Mao didn't. He was a machine. And it's like his brain thought of other human beings as fodder for his political experiments. That what makes Mao to me so chilling. He didn't lose his temper. He wasn't happy. He wasn't sad. He wasn't mad. He wasn't delighted. He was just an ideological machine. And that's why I think that Mao is the most chilling.
child enjoyed finding the most intriguing, whether it's because of the TV you did the most, or they have the most interesting story, why did you find that the most intriguing?
Most intriguing probably was our friend Svetlana, because after her father died, she found religion and became an Orthodox Christian. And then she defected and got rich and famous, and then got rather forgotten and resented it. So she went back to the Soviet Union in 1984, immediately regretted it, was treated shabbily, asked to leave immediately. She was saved by the rise of Gorbachev to power. And after a year and a half, the dictatorship under Gorbachev, which was ever less a dictatorship, let her out. And she flew back and landed at O'Hare Airport in Chicago and said, I had to leave to find out how wonderful it was in the free West. But she was always a vagabond, always a wanderer and a seeker. She tried a great many religions, and she lived in a great many places, contemplated becoming a nun once. And because she was intellectual and literary, she could tell you what she thought. And she could tell you what it was like to be the daughter of Stalin. And that's why people like me kind of clutch her close, because she really knows. It's a very moving story. She could be just awful to other human beings, but you kind of forgave her. A friend of mine hosted her, the British historian David Price Jones, and she stayed with the Price Joneses for something like 10 days. And as David says, she had her father's yellow tiger's eyes. And she came to stay with them on one condition, and David's an historian, mind you, that he asked nothing about her father. And then she would come down to breakfast and talk of nothing but.
I want to verify a fact made in your book about North Korea. I read North Korea 2 years ago. I did see this basketball signed by...
Oh, you saw the very basketball?
Yeah, but I cannot prove it because a picture, a photo, you cannot take a photo inside this international exhibit hall. Yeah, I did see that.
Wow. It's very rare to meet someone who has been to North Korea. It wouldn't need more than both of my hands.
I spent like $400 for a 5-day business stay in a 5-star hotel. Yeah, my question to you is, you also wrote about the history of the Nobel Peace Prize. I'm wondering what's the common and also difference between the son and daughters of this monster and the Nobel Prize.
Yeah. Bill Bennett wrote a best-selling book called The Book of Virtues. And his son told him he should write a follow-up called The Book of Vices, that it would sell more. It's been suggested to me that I write a book about the sons and daughters of saints and heroes. That can be a pretty miserable thing also, something to live up to. And of course, some of them aren't so hot as parents, these heroes and saints. I know a lot about these heroes and saints from that book. And you know what I discovered? One thing, the peace business is not a business for small egos. There are really big egos in the peace business. And I think some of the sons and daughters have a lot of trouble. But it is an intriguing question. The sons and daughters of the famous have things in common. But sons and daughters of those with absolute political control over the country, especially, have a lot in common. And so a follow-up book would be interesting. I'm not inclined to write it, but it has been suggested. Yes?
When I was reading the book, I always thought, after every page, I thought I wouldn't have been able to finish it. Because I got very emotional, I got very nervous.
Did you keep going?
Sorry?
Did you keep going?
Yes.
I kept going too.
And one morning, when I started cooking in the morning, I wasn't aware of the time. My husband came and then asked me, oh God, are you still reading? And doing t-shirts. Was there any time that I
I started to read the book aside, I worried about it, but I couldn't. Was there any time that you didn't want to search anymore?
This man was kind enough to mention my history of the Nobel Peace Prize. I loved writing that book. Could have gone on and on. Loved what I was learning, the personalities I was communicating with, so to speak. I very much enjoyed writing Children of Monsters, and I was very glad to be done with it. Very glad. And to move on, to wash my hands of it. So I've created a record. It is in part a sensational book, sensationalistic. It's in part a macabre book. But there are also, I think, streaks of uplift in it and streaks of hope. But it does teach you something about the nature of dictatorship. And so many people in the world live under dictatorship. And I spent a good part of my career interacting with them, with dissidents and former political prisoners, people who risk everything. And I must say that liberal democracy, you sometimes wonder whether it will be just a parenthesis in history. It's so rare, it's so easy to take for granted when you're born into it. But the more you know about history and even the current world, the more you realize it's kind of abnormal. Blessed constitutional freedom. And so let's hang on to it for as long as we can. Just think of the North Koreans. Let me tell you something about South Korea. They just impeached their president. This is a democratically elected president, a woman, mind you, who was impeached by a democratically elected legislature, whose decision was confirmed by a legitimate constitutional court. And the woman left office. And in the North, and the reason I stress the Korean Peninsula, these are the same people, the same human beings, the same race, with the same ancestry, the same traditions, the same language, the same food to the extent the North Koreans can eat. And one half of the peninsula is light, literally, with electric lights, and the other half is literally dark, what Jay Nordlinger called a psychotic state, a perfect monstrous totalitarian state. And so when people tell you that democracy and freedom are for some and not for others, don't believe it. It's just a lie. All these Koreans on that peninsula are the same. They're all Korean. It's just their systems of government are different. And we heard for years and years, East Asia will never have democracy. It's incompatible with Asian values. That was the excuse of people who wanted to continue autocracy. They said Southern Europe wouldn't have democracy. Take the Iberian Peninsula, Spain and Portugal. These people worship altar and throne. They'll never accept liberal democracy, which is just for the Anglo-Americans. Nonsense. Nonsense. It's not true. I forgot why I got on this subject, but anyway. I'll check my watch. Whenever you want to give me the hook, Professor, where is he? Give me the hook when it's time.
So obviously, to be the son or daughter of these monsters, as you call it, is really an exclusive group of people. Do you think there are any lessons to be learned for people like us who will never have any clue what it's like to be put in that situation? Do you think there's stuff we can still learn from them regardless?
Yeah. Obey conscience to the extent possible. And remember that you're an individual and that you owe your allegiance to truth, no matter what your parents or other people are doing. I think that's a very strong lesson. It can be so very, very hard to break away. But a true individual conscience is a great thing. A great thing.
Does the kingdom have like another successor on the way, or is it like a dying breed?
Well, there have been three. Will there be a fourth? Who knows? A third would have been hard to predict. That dictatorship has been going on since the end of the war, the end of World War II. It's a long time now. Cuban dictatorship since 1959. The Chinese Communist Party has been in control since the late 40s. Although they've loosened, it's still a one-party dictatorship with a gulag. Will there be a fourth? I would say no. But I would follow that up with, I wouldn't have bet on a third.
After examining what some of the children of these dictators grew up to be like, what can your book tell us about nature versus nurture?
Don't know. It's funny how different children turn about. So I imagine there are a lot of parents in this room, parents who have more than one child, and aren't they different? And same food, same instruction, same neighborhood, same rules, and they can be so very, very different. Why is Valentin nice and sweet and he just wants to do his physics and have coffee with his friends at the cafe? How if I know? He could have done anything. He had absolute license. It's another general point to make. These sons, let's stick with the sons, had absolute license. The Saddam Hussein kids could do anything in Iraq. Anything. Including to the rich and powerful. And I detail some of this in my book. And some of these sons, in particular, exploit this license, and some don't. I'm really not sure why. You say, well, maybe it's because they studied in the West. They all study in the West. The worst of these bastards study in the West. Doesn't make any difference. Well, maybe it's because they had a kind-hearted mother who was a mitigating influence on the father. Oh. I really can't discern patterns. You just don't know. You have any corrections to make?
What I would like to say is, from what I know, between Nico and Valentin, right? He was the favorite, he was the youngest. So he was the favorite of his mother. He was extremely spoiled since he was a young child. They had a lot of privilege, and all of those kids have a lot of privilege. They have special stores, the entire country can starve, and they will have everything under the sky. And they will be allowed to do what? The parenting is not there at all. That's another. Parents are way too busy with their political agenda. And is not, so the kids are left in the care of secret service agents or some nannies. Some might be better than the others. So basically, from what I know, the influence, especially in the Romanian children, in Valentin's and Zoya, were the friends. And growing up and wanting to be part of, the so-called intellectual elite at that time. They were very smart, both of them. Nico was a true spoiled brat. And he could get away with whatever he wanted. And the parents, actually, Ceausescu didn't know what he used to do. Just to give you an example, he had a huge party over one of his little palaces, and he used to have mussels flown from Ireland that night back to Romania. You can imagine the cost, right? And he will have a group of people, which were some of the elite in the party. And first, pardon my language, but it's exactly what he will pee on all those and then force all of them to eat the mussels. That's how he behaved. Do you think anyone dared to go and tell Ceausescu what he did? No. So a lot of those, I think the parenting, it was nurture, but the nurture was not there from the parent. And it's why they tend to be also monsters. So that's my opinion.
You should write a memoir.
Oh.
I would be the first reader of it.
I said that for a long time.
Get it down. That posterity will thank you.
And you will do something to me.
Vasily Stalin was just like that. Saddam's boys were exactly like that. Stalin once, when he found out about what Vasily was doing, demoted him in the military, but then re-promoted him. Same type of thing. Murderous orgies. That part is brief in my book. Let's end on something nicer. Anyone who hasn't asked a question, don't be shy. Going once, going twice.
Do you think the kids of like these dictators and stuff kind of differ from kids of like say like Pablo Escobar or huge like things like drug lord, mafia, cartel type weird? Do you think their kids differ?
I don't think so. I don't think so. Someone like Pablo Escobar is a kind of dictator in his region, in his area of control. And also, I'm sure that the children of these drug cartel types are in some danger. We see this in Mexico. They didn't ask to be placed in this situation. But it's just like being a mob kid, kind of born into the family. But some of these men and women do rise above their circumstances. I don't want to suggest that there is no volition involved. Because for one thing, that would be unfair to the men and women who do make admirable decisions. There is some volition involved. It just takes often it takes a titanic struggle that you and I might not have. And this is true in private lives all over. That, heaven knows the problems that families have. And some children are entrapped and scarred and smashed down. And some manage to break free, even in horrifying circumstances. So there's always something to write about. On that lame, weak, platitudinous note, thank you so much for being here. Thank you so much. And